The Monterey Public Library welcomes you to Cannery Row Days. Thank you to our sponsors, the City of Monterey, Cannery Row Company, Cannery Row Foundation, and Western Flyer Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome today's moderator, Emily Gottlieb, who is the Education Director of the Western Flyer Foundation. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Francesca. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third in this series of talks about Cannery Row. I have the honor of presenting 4 guests today who are going to be speaking. So we're going to be hearing from William Gilly, Sydney Schmitter, Nicole Gell, who are two students at Stanford. And then later on, we'll be hearing a little bit from Geoffrey Dunn. So we're going to start off with a presentation from William Gilly. So William Gilly is a professor of biology at Stanford University, Hopkins Marine Station, with a specialty in Humboldt squid. He also sits on the board of the Western Flyer Foundation, so I have the honor of working with him. Sydney Schmitter is an undergraduate at Stanford University. She's studying Earth Systems and Urban Studies. Nicole Gell is also an undergraduate at Stanford University, studying human biology and sustainability. Sydney and Nicole are both working with Dr. Gilly this year to assist him in his work bridging the natural sciences and humanities. So I'm going to pass it over to them for their presentation.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Am I audible? Okay. So frogs, octopi, and a gopher, Ed Ricketts in Fact and Fiction. Thank you, Susan, for assigning this topic because it certainly made us think and adapt. Let's just start. This is a passage that we found in Cannery Row that really came to symbolize a lot for us. And it's always seemed strange to me, said Doc, the things we admire in men, kindness and generosity, openness, honesty, understanding, and feeling are concomitants of failure in our system. And those traits we detest, sharpness, greed, acquisitiveness, meanness, egotism, and self-interest, are the traits of success. And while men admire the quality of the first, they love the produce of the second. So this idea of the distinction between good and bad and the duality of life and death and the grayness of everything, the liminality of things, is really what we think is Cannery Row is all about. And that's what we're going to be talking about today through the stories of these 3 animals that was our homework assignment. So next. And in reality, we quickly realized that this concept of duality and good and bad is not just something in Cannery Row. It's fundamental to Steinbeck and Ricketts' thinking, and it comes out strong in Log from the Sea of Cortez. So this passage, I won't read the whole thing, but it's about the paradox between good and bad, how things that seem to be good tend to be actually qualities of bad people, and how things that seem bad tend to be qualities of good people. He uses, I think, Jesus as an example of someone who has these qualities that we would perceive as bad and who's really a good person. And man might be described as a 2-legged paradox. He has never become accustomed to the tragic miracle of consciousness. So to us, all of Cannery Row is really a tribute to this concept of the tragic miracle of consciousness and the sort of the non-teleological thinking approach to the duality between good and bad, humans and nature, life and death. Next.
All right.
Nicole.
Yes. Hello. So in our presentation, we'll be closely examining the frog, octopus, and gopher scenes. So in this first section, I'd like to discuss how the octopus scene featured in Chapter 18 embodies Cannery Row's themes of balance and liminality, as Dr. Gilly mentioned. Next slide, please. So in the tide pool, the setting of the scene, the tide pool is introduced as this liminal space in between extremes. Intertidals are known for harboring resilient organisms who can withstand the conditions underwater, as well as above water in the unforgiving sun. So Steinbeck says, on the exposed rocks, the starfish emit semen and eggs from between their rays. The smells of life and richness, of death and digestion, of decay and birth burden the air. This intertidal is described as this place of interconnectedness, simultaneously showing life and death, and like Steinbeck said, this decay and birth. Next slide, please. So the intertidal is initially described as this exclusively natural place. Doc notices these interactions between predatory octopi and prey. Steinbeck writes in this passage, then the creeping murderer, the octopus, seals out, slowly, softly, moving like a gray mist, pretending now to be a bit of weed, now a rock, and now a lump of decaying meat, while its evil goat eyes watched coldly. And here we noticed that the octopus is the ultimate scene of this uncertainty and ambiguity, and of this life in the intertidal between extremes, as most evidenced by this shape-shifting description where the octopus is compared to a goat, a lump of decaying meat, a bit of weed, a rock, really showing this ambiguity of life. And this life in the intertidal also includes much death. Next slide, please. And here, the Steinbeck describes another predatory deathly encounter with the octopus and the crab. So he says, it oozes slowly and flows towards a feeding crab. And as it comes close, its yellow eyes burn and its body turns rosy with the pulsing color of anticipation and rage. Then it suddenly runs lightly on the tips of its arms as ferociously as a charging cat. It leaps savagely on the crab. There is a puff of black fluid, and the struggling mass is obscured in the sepia cloud while the octopus murders the crab. So Steinbeck crafts this scene like one might imagine a wildlife documentary. The realities of nature and the ways of species are matter-of-factly and cruelly laid out. There's nothing hidden behind fluffier language. And we notice that in this way, the great tide pool embodies this natural world with life and balance, showing this great life of the octopus, and on the other end, the death and murder of the crab. Next slide. And this scene completely changes when Doc looks up from observing this predatory scene and is shocked to find a dead girl floating in the intertidal, where the reef falls off into deep water. Steinbeck writes in this passage, a girl's face looked up at him, a pretty pale girl with dark hair. The eyes were open and clear, and the face was firm, and the hair washed gently about her head. The body was out of sight, caught in the crevice. The lips were slightly parted, and the teeth showed, and on the face was only comfort and rest. Just underwater it was, and the clear water made it very beautiful. It seemed to Doc that he looked at it for many minutes, and the face burned into his picture memory. So in this scene, Doc is both disturbed and awestruck by the dead girl. He says in another quote later that he shivered and his eyes were wet, the way they get in the focus of great beauty. So here Steinbeck again is introducing the paradoxes of humanity and nature, with death as both sad and beautiful. Doc is not disgusted by the dead girl in this scene. In fact, he gazes on her a while and only comments on her beauty. Like he said, his eyes were wet, but the way they get in the focus of great beauty. And there's no mention necessarily of tragedy or disgust. And we thought that this scene is related to the intertidal's theme of interconnectedness and of this simultaneous life and death. By involving this human girl in the scene and having her play the role of death in the natural scene, Steinbeck reminds us that humanity and nature are inextricably connected. The scene demonstrates this ultimate balance between humanity and nature, with also a subtle commentary that we are not as separate from nature as we think. Next slide. Hi, in this section, I'll be discussing the gopher's portrayal of a life out of balance, as well as themes of poison, traps, and avoidance in Cannery Row. So we are first introduced to these themes, as well as John Steinbeck's non-teleological thinking on page 18. In this, Steinbeck writes, Mac and the boys are the beauties, the virtues, the graces. In the world ruled by tigers with ulcers, rutted by strictured bulls, scavenged by blind jackals, Mac and the boys dine delicately with the tigers, fondle the frantic heifers, and wrap up the crumbs to feed the seagulls of Cannery Row. What can profit a man to gain the whole world and to come to his property with a gastric ulcer, a blown prostate, and bifocals? Mac and the boys avoid the trap, walk around the poison, step over the noose, while a generation of trapped, poisoned, and trussed up men scream at them and call them no goods, come to bad ends, blots on the town, thieves, rascals, bums. So, as Steinbeck writes, Mac and the boys really do epitomize the keystone paradox that Doc describes, where things are neither good nor bad. This passage also introduces the symbols of traps and poison and avoidance. The vacant lot and the flop house provide Mac and the boys with a safe haven as long as they keep their distance away from the rattling, bustling, noisy daytime Cannery Row. However, at the end of the day, it's quoted, the bums who retired in disgust under the back cypress tree come to sit out on the rusty pipes in the vacant lot. At this point, Cannery Row seems that itself is a place where poisoned or trapped or trussed up beings work, and Cannery Row itself is described as a trap or a poison to be avoided. We see the theme of traps and avoidance continued in the description of the gopher in Cannery Row. In chapter 31, we're introduced to a gopher that's living in a burrow very close to Cannery Row. The gopher is described as fat and sleek with plenty of food in his cheek pouches. The gopher is also described with fawn-colored fur on his chest that was incredibly soft and rich. And altogether, the gopher is described as a beautiful gopher in the prime of his life. So this passage demonstrates that the gopher feels safe in its burrow, and it's described as being in the prime of its life, similarly to Mac and the boys when they are in the vacant lot and in the flop house. However, the gopher, in desiring a mate, is enticed to leave its burrow and enter the broader, more unsafe world outside. So in this passage, Steinbeck writes, but as time went on, the gopher began to be a little impatient, for no female appeared. He sat in the entrance of his hole in the morning and made penetrating squeaks that are inaudible to the human ear, but can be heard deep in the earth by other gophers. And still, no female appeared. Finally, in a sweat of impatience, he went up across the track until he found another gopher hole. He squeaked provocatively in the entrance. He heard a rustling and smelled female, and then out of the hole came an old, battle-torn bull gopher who mauled and bit him so badly that he crept home and lay in his great chamber for 3 days recovering, and he lost 2 toes from one front paw from that bite. So when the gopher leaves its burrow and reaches the trap or the poison of the outside world that's not its burrow, he immediately encounters what Steinbeck describes as the poison or the trapped and the tussed up bull gopher who has been changed by the poison out of the outside world. To avoid this, the gopher has to retreat to his burrow. Eventually, the gopher has to move to a different location from his safe and unpoisoned burrow. But in this new location, the gopher is faced with dangerous and poisonous new surroundings and is put in a more precarious situation. As we see from this quote, Steinbeck writes, he had to move 2 blocks up the hill to a dahlia garden where they put out traps every night. So the themes of traps and avoidance really highlight the gopher's role in depicting life as being out of balance. The gopher cannot live in harmony with the outside world and find a mate because the dangers of traps and poison gophers pose too much of a threat. Steinbeck continues this theme of examining the balance within the natural world and depicting the relationship between humans and nature. Ultimately, the gopher is forced to move into dangerous territory where they put out traps every night in order to find a mate and survive.
Well, I'm going to cover this last chapter of the trilogy, The Frog Hunt, which isn't just a story about life out of balance, but it's really about life unalterably perturbed. And the story starts out happily enough. The frogs live in a idyllic Carmel River where there's high biodiversity with their friends, the turtles and the crayfish and the trout. And then their world gets invaded a little bit by Mac and the boys, who are there to collect frogs for Doc so they can fund the party. Next slide. So I'd like to just think about the hunt itself, rather than the role of whiskey in the hunt and things like that also make a good story. But during the millennia that frogs and men have lived in the same world, it's probable that men have hunted frogs. During that time, a pattern of hunt and parry has developed. Man with the net or bow or lance creeps noiselessly as he thinks toward the frog. This pattern requires that the frog sit still, very still, and wait. The rules of the game require the frog to wait until the final flicker of a second, when the net is descending, when the lance is in the air, when the finger squeezes the trigger, when the frog jumps, plops into the water, swims to the bottom, and waits until the man goes away. That's the way it is done, the way it has always been done. Frogs have every right to expect it will be done that way. And frog hunting, as you see, is an ancient art, but in today's society, we seem to think it's been lost. It seems very easy to find articles online about the lost art of frog hunting. I don't know why. Next slide. But frog hunting isn't just about frog hunting. I think it's about many other subjects. The most analogous, the easiest analogy would be with hunting other animals. And so in this case, bison, the buffalo chase, we can see some Native Americans dealing with bison in a kind of a close and personal way. The bison are goring their horses, and it looks like a fairly dangerous and exciting adventure. But this is the way it was done. This is the way it's always done. Next slide. But now and then, the net's too quick. The lance pierces, the gun flicks, and that frog is gone, but is all fair and in the framework. Frogs don't resent that, but how could they have anticipated Mac's new method? How could they have foreseen the horror that followed? So here's an Old English illustration of frog hunting that's a historical precedent for Mac's new technique, where a whole army of people gather around a pond and charge into it, and someone on the shore picks them up and throws them in a gunny sack. In this case, they're getting skewered on some kind of stick. But this is a new method, and it was never ever done before, except maybe in the imagination of Thomas Rawlinson. But it was really effective. Next slide. And if we think about the case of the buffalo, this is where we end up. The sudden flashing of lights, the shouting and squealing of men, the rush of feet. Every frog leaped, plopped into the pool, and swam frantically to the bottom. A few frogs lost their heads and floundered among the feet and got through these, and these were saved. But the majority decided to leave the pool forever and find a new home in a new country where this kind of thing didn't happen. A wave of frantic, frustrated frogs, big ones, little ones, brown ones, green ones, men frogs and women frogs. A wave of them broke over the bank, crawled, leaped, and scrambled. They clambered up the grass, they clutched at each other, little ones rode on big ones, and then horror on horror, the flashlights found them. So in this case, the train has found the bison, and this really played a pretty good role in extermination of near extermination of bison, near extinction of bison in the Pacific West. Next slide. But never in frog history had such an execution taken place. Now, I think Steinbeck is trying to get at more than just inhumanity to animals, whether they're frogs or bison or passenger pigeons. And what he's really thinking about is World War II. So here we have a war where things were done that were never done before. It started out with blatant, never before done things like Kristallnacht, and developed on into blitz bombing of London and other English cities. And so this was a pretty significant event in world history. And it's, during the time that Steinbeck's writing Cannery Row. And so I think this frog scene relates to just the terrible destruction of war and the Holocaust, and the total disruption of the life of many, many people. Next slide. So for a while, Cannery Row crawled with frogs. This was after the party when the frogs escaped. It was overrun with frogs. A taxi which brought a very late customer to the Bear Flag squashed 5 frogs in the street, but they were well before dawn, they had all gone. Some found the sewer, and some worked their way up to the hill to the reservoir, and some went into culverts, and only some hid among the weeds in the vacant lot, and the lights blazed in the quiet, empty laboratory. So even though the frogs weren't all exterminated, they did escape. But the life they found themselves in now, well, squashed in the street isn't too good, but living in a sewer is not much better. The reservoir up the hill is now bone dry for the last 25 years, and so on. So even though they didn't all, they weren't all extincted, there was no going back to the Carmel River and their idyllic life before. So life in this case was unalterably changed, which is what we think Steinbeck is talking about in regard to the war and its effect on him and everyone else. So next slide. Where does this leave us? How much time do we have?
Just about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, we brought this question up in our planning, and if you were listening closely earlier, I used the word liminality, which I used it as a noun for the state of being liminal. But in reality, liminality has a much more specific meaning. Next slide. And in this case, we discovered that liminality is sort of a theory developed by Arnold van Gennep in a book, Rites of Passage, in 1909. And it's a state of transition between one stage and the next, especially between major stages in someone's life or during a rite of passage. So it's a sort of an in-between period where great uncertainty exists. So this theory of liminality is a Jungian, has Jungian origins, and we think it could apply to this, the themes we've been developing here. So the octopus intertidal scene. Nicole, do you want to say anything about this scene?
Yes, so like I touched on a little bit earlier, we wanted to bring this back to the theme of liminality, and notice that this intertidal, like I mentioned, is this liminal zone between the extremes of high and low tide, life and death, with resilient organisms that are both able to survive underwater and in very dry, hot conditions. And we noticed, again, bringing back this quote, the smells of life and richness, of death and digestion, of decay and birth, bird in the air. So again, kind of going back to the liminality definition, this intertidal scene, this octopus scene, is this in-between period. It is this transition between the natural life and humanity, with the dead girl between life and death. And we thought that Steinbeck was aware of this idea and really wanted to bring this idea to life in this scene.
And gopher, Sydney?
Yes, so in the gopher chapter, we see the gopher transitioning from safety in its burrow to going out and going into danger in order to seek a mate. And then from there, going back to the state of danger to safety and fear. So again, this marks a period of liminality, and this gopher is going in through an in-between period in its life between safety and danger, the two extremes. And there is a lot of uncertainty in whether the gopher will be safe, if the gopher will find a mate, and things like that.
And then finally, again, in the frog hunt, it's a transition from the way things have always been to new and totally unconventional war tactics that lead to inhuman extinction, basically. That indeed is a serious transition of uncertainty. So I guess with that, we can end and have a discussion at some point. Thank you. Thank you, Sydney and Nicole.
Thank you very much, William, Sydney, and Nicole, for that really wonderful discussion and deep, thoughtful look at some of the animals in Cannery Row. That was great. And just as a reminder to our participants, we are going to be opening this up to discussion at the very end, so after our next talk. So if you have questions about this talk, you can type them into the chat or hang on to them until the very end when we have our Q&A session. All right. So let's see. Okay, so at this point, I am very pleased to introduce Geoffrey Dunn. So Geoffrey Dunn is an award-winning journalist. He's a filmmaker and an historian, and he's written extensively about California culture and history. He's the author of several books, including Santa Cruz is in the Heart, Volumes 1 and 2, The Santa Cruz Wharf, Images of America, Chinatown Dreams, The Life and Photography of George Lee, and The Lives of Sarah Palin. His films include Dollar a Day, 10 Cents a Dance, A Historic Portrait of Filipino Farm Workers in America, Chinese Gold, The Chinese of Monterey Bay Region, Calypso Dreams, and The Glamour Boys Again. A fourth-generation member of the Santa Cruz Italian fishing colony, Dunn taught at UC Santa Cruz for 25 years. He's been researching Ed Ricketts and the mythos of Cannery Row for 4 decades. He is currently at work on a play about the friendship of Ricketts and Steinbeck entitled Sardine Dreams. I would love to see that play. So, Geoffrey, if you're ready, I'm going to pass this over to you and have you share your screen so that we can see your presentation. And I think you're still on mute, Geoffrey.
All right, is it up yet?
It is, and if you go to the slideshow, then we'll be able to see it full screen.
Slideshow. What do I hit then? All right. I want to talk today about my personal reflections on the novel and Cannery Row, and I also like to reference Sweet Thursday because I think it's an important, if imperfect, sequel to Cannery Row, and probably because I came to Cannery Row through Sweet Thursday. It took on a combined aspect for me when I first encountered it. What I wanted to say, and let's see if I can get this to work here. This was the version of Cannery Row I first read. And I read it when I was the same age as Nicole and Sydney. I read it after the summer of my freshman year at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I had played semi-pro baseball for part of that summer and then quit, and somehow got a copy of Sweet Thursday and realized, oh, I read this the wrong way. I needed to find the original Cannery Row. And so I read Cannery Row while I was camped out in Big Sur at Pfeiffer State Park Campground. And it changed my life, the reading of that book. It opened up windows to my own soul, I think, and sensibilities and aesthetic and sense of ecology, sense of the world, sense of character. And I saw people in my life in it. And you'll get a sense why in a little bit. And the character of Doc, I immediately related to, even though I realized that he was a fictional composition of someone. I quickly learned that there was a real man behind this character, Ed Ricketts. For a long time, I thought that Doc Ricketts was a real entity, but no, it's Ed Ricketts and the character of Doc. And people conflate the two all the time. I'm sure I will today. But during my discussions with people who knew Ricketts, I realized, no, he went by Ed, that he was a real figure and different from Doc in certain ways, and we need to respect that. Shortly after I read the book, I discovered this two-part series that it had been edited by Joel Hedgepeth, and the writings of Ed Ricketts. Doc was a real writer. These papers that Steinbeck referenced in Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday were real. He was a real marine biologist and a real figure. And there were these unpublished essays that I will tell you, the day that the first volume arrived at my home, I pulled out 3 bottles of wine and celebrated with friends. And we read passages of Cannery Row and The Outer Shores here together. All of my close friends, if you're a close friend of mine, you've read Cannery Row, because I required it of my friends. It was something that I wanted to share with people. And when the woman who I had met and who would become my wife left for Europe, I made sure she had a copy of Cannery Row so that she understood who I was while she was traveling around Europe. I corresponded with Joel at the time, and the very first piece I wrote about Ed Ricketts, Cannery Row, marine biology, etc., was a review of these 2 volumes, and I wrote it for I was 22 or 23, and I wrote it for a West Coast publication that I thought might take a lengthy review of it, and they did. And so I sent it to Ed. I sent it to Joel. I sent it to Ed Ricketts Jr., and I sent it to Nancy Ricketts, and developed friendships with all because of this initial review. The book had this photo in it of Ed with Tony, Richie Lovejoy, and I think someone would know who that is, the young kid there. It was misidentified in the book. But anyway, here he is with a bottle of something to drink right at Pacific Biological Laboratories. It's the Doc of Cannery Row, as I perceived him, but it's also Ed Ricketts, so it's both. And this image, I asked Joel for a copy of it, and he sent it to me at the time. It came from Ed Ricketts Jr. I've seen the original and held it even. And this image of Ed, of Doc, has usually been up in my house somewhere. It's a treasured image. and the sensibility it evoked in me was deep and passionate. Now, I show this shot of me. This is me at the time on the left on the Santa Cruz Wharf with my cousin Bill Stagnero. I worked in the fishing industry until I was 30. I dropped out of graduate school to come back, probably because I saw that all those values that Steinbeck and Doc were attributing to success in Cannery Row were not for me. And I wanted to come back, and that's me on the left with a pile of fish to cut, to be one of Mac and the boys. It was more important for me to be one of the crew than to be a successful academic or anything else. So I dropped out of Cornell School of Government and came here. Ironically, for our friends from Stanford here, my faculty member came from Cornell to Stanford that year, who was going to be my advisor for my doctorate. And I made him come down and see the activity on the wharf and basically asked him, why the hell would I ever want to leave? Hedgepath at the time sent me a letter from Jean Harris. And it's hard to read here, but it was a letter that Jean Harris, who had been Doc's lover, had sent to Joel about their relationship. And through the letter and through my conversation with Joel about the letter, I learned a lot about the Steinbeck and Ricketts relationship. And one of the things that Jean Harris wrote in here, she referred to Ed as Edward always, was that she felt that Steinbeck had burned Ed's letters after he died and had done what he could to, in a way, destroy the record of Ed's influence on him. And I think that if you read Steinbeck's accounts of his relationship with Ed, of his famous essay about Ed Ricketts, there's a minimalization going on, a cartoonish kind of quality to Ed that really wasn't accurate. And I strongly believe that their relationship, their friendship, are what created critical mass for Steinbeck to write his greatest works. This was given to me by a friend who found this mailing label that I've kept also very close to me throughout my life. I felt a need, even today, to feel close to Ricketts and to feel close to the story, to feel close to his flame. He's like a totem figure for me, and he's at the top of my totem pole. Another shot of the laboratories. About 10 years ago, I was going through some booklets at the Santa Cruz Museum of Modern Art, and they were from the 1920s. They're called Municipal Wharfingers Cash Book, one from 1915 to 1922, the other one from 22 to 28. And the reason I was going through them was because it was the wharf's 100th anniversary in 1914, 1915. I wanted to document my own family's history on the Santa Cruz Wharf. There was a lot of myths about who was there first, second, how the Italian fishing colony moved from what was called the Railroad Wharf to the Municipal Wharf in Santa Cruz, which is a lot of details we don't need to go into. But while going through this book and the pages, I found in 1925, and if you're able to see on the right page, numbered 91, May of 1925, right at the top of that section, it says E.F. Ricketts. And I saw the name and went, excuse me, WTF, as kids say today? What the hell is that? Now, the list on the left and on the bottom, I'm probably related to half the people there. the Stagneros, the Castagnolos, the Brigantes, the Carnelias, the Perezes, the Guillos are all my mom's family. And almost right next to Ricketts is my great uncle Maulio, who I lived with for many years, his early business establishment at the wharf. So May 2nd, 1925, E.F. Ricketts becomes a former tenant at the Santa Cruz Municipal Wharf for $10 a month. And he remained one till roughly 1928, when he consolidated the move from Pacific Grove to Cannery Row. This is my mom's family. My mom on the lower right, my grandmother mid-left, my Aunt Childa, who was on the wharf for many years and as a baby, and my great-grandmother. So there's 4 generations here of the family. And you can see they would have been denizens of the row. And this is the male side of the family, actually on the wharf. My grandfather on the far right holding a large salmon. That's a catch of raw cod in the basket. And the fellow next to my grandfather's his younger brother, my uncle Maulio, who was born in 1900 and who died in 1985, and with whom I lived, and who I might add is reported to have beat Steinbeck in the mile in 1919 at the Monterey Bay Relays, Central Coast Relays, and who was the first person to introduce me to the colorful history of Monterey Bay, both in Monterey and in Santa Cruz and throughout the region, quite frankly. I cut fish with the guy in the center. I cut fish with the guy on the left, and my Uncle Tisto on the far left's brother, Monk Lawuro, oversaw General Fish in Monterey during these Steinbeck years on the Monterey waterfront. He was a friend of Ricketts, and at the Monterey Library, if you look, they have a copy of a picture of him with one of Gilly's Humboldt squid. And it's about the same size, same era as the one that Ricketts was holding. So I wondered if they might have even been at the same time, the same Humboldt squid. So this was the milieu that I grew up in and still live in. I live about 3 miles from the old Italian fishing colony, which here was called the Barranca. My cousins, some of them are still involved with it. And it influenced my reading of Cannery Row. I want to get to this point a bit later. One of the things about Cannery Row, to me, that I find fascinating is it is about liminality, and I find that I come back to it when I'm in a liminal period. When I first read it, I was going from being, a high school kid to encountering the university and encountering love. It was a coming of age novel for me. And Ed Ricketts was, and Doc was an older role model. One that I thought I could never really aspire to. I thought, Mac and the Boys was going to be as good as it gets, and I'll be a fishmonger my whole life. Then I realized, well, I can be an intellectual, even though I grew up in an intensely anti-intellectual family, and I became one without ever quite losing my roots in the fishery. And I kept researching the history of the region, did a film on Filipinos. Steinbeck actually wrote a really kind of horrible 2 stories about Filipinos while he was at Stanford. I don't know if they've been published anywhere other than the Stanford magazine, but they were racialized, if not racist portraits. His portraits of Chinese Americans in Cannery Row and his other works, pretty racialized, if not racist. And, the portrait of Latinos, pretty much a caricature. So in my work, I fleshed those out in both film and my writing. And at the same time, I was introduced and inspired to by the tone and the novel and the portraits in Cannery Row. What it showed me was that the life I had grown up with was worthy of introspection, worthy of literary portrayal, and that I didn't need to go off to Cornell to engage something of value. It was all right here. And I've always been grateful to Steinbeck for that. But my own personal relationship with him and his ghost is very different from my relationship with Ed Ricketts. I wanted to come back to this story here that I worked on with Tim Thomas about, I'm going to say roughly 10 years ago. I got a call from Tim. He can correct me. I forget how long ago, maybe 6 years ago. I got a call from Tim saying he had found these petitions that had been written and signed by members of the Monterey community, all walks of Monterey's community, that was a response to what was a racist, white supremacist, anti-Japanese political move out of Salinas in 1945, near the end of the war. So Gilly was talking about the relationship of Cannery Row to the war. Cannery Row never explicitly mentions World War II. There are metaphorical references, but there are none. Of course, Sweet Thursday does. But right around the time that Cannery Row is published, which I believe is January, February of 1945, there's talk of the Japanese who had been interned into what have been called internment camps, now more, I think, accurately referred to as concentration camps, that the Japanese who had been living in Monterey, in Santa Cruz, Salinas, Monterey, Watsonville, all along California, were going to be coming back to where they had lived. And in Salinas, the Salinas Chamber of Commerce, the Salinas Growing Shipper and Vegetable Association, and the Monterey Bay Council of Japanese Relations, as they identified themselves, put out massive ads in local newspapers arguing that the Japanese should not come back home. And there were all these racist criticisms of the Japanese, that they couldn't be trusted, really derogatory comments. And Tim told me he had found these petitions from Monterey that had been signed by roughly 500 people that said, no, we want them to come back home. And he said, Jeff, guess what? Ed Ricketts, his lover at the time, Tony, who used the last name Ricketts, and Steinbeck had all signed these petitions. And I thought, oh my God, this is a great bit of news. The fascism that Gilly referred to in his piece, it turned out Ed Ricketts was thinking about those very issues. And I went over to the morgue. They still had one at the Monterey Herald. They still had a paper then. And one of my friends who was working at the Herald said, go into the files and see if you can find anything on this. And what I found was a letter that Ricketts had written in April of 1945, in which he had talked about this action in Salinas reflecting what had been going on in Germany. And he says, in due time, these ideas of racism can be applied successfully to other recent Americans, to Filipinos and Negroes and Jews, to children of Chinese, German, and Polish ancestry, until finally there shall be left here a unique country, only the few thousand yet remaining of our true original natives, the American Indians. And so Hitler suffering in his own land a death, perhaps neglected and unhonored, richly succeeds here in America. Truly a prophet hath no honor in his own country. Respectfully, Edward F.R. Ricketts. And I wanted to sort of come back to this here at the end here, because I don't want this conference or this book to be taken out of the context in which we are now living. And as I said, it's remarkable to me, 75 years after it was written, how timely and timeless Cannery Row still is. In many ways, Ricketts was way ahead of his time in understanding ecosystems and the global ecology. Certainly, global warming and all the environmental issues we now face, he foresaw and understood that we needed to take a global perspective on it. But I couldn't help but think of this letter by Ricketts the other night as I was watching our presidential debate, and our current president unwilling to denounce white supremacy and to actually give a call out to a group that reminded me of this group from Salinas that Ed Ricketts and all the rest of his friends had risen up to counter in 1945. And I think it's important for us, for all the beauties of Cannery Row, to think about the courage it took for Ricketts and all of the others in Monterey to stand up, not against fascism in Europe, but against fascism here in our own country, and the thread of white supremacy that has persisted in this country from its very founding to this present time. And for all his miracles and wonders, that even when it came to that issue, Ed Ricketts was very much ahead of his time, and I think still is. I think what's happening is that Ricketts' writings, which I thought were pretty esoteric and irrelevant when I first encountered them, really are spot on and reflect a very present understanding of our global issues and of the human species. So how much time do I have?
You're just at about 2 minutes.
Well, how about I give those 2 minutes back, and thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Geoffrey.
Thank you. Now, how do I get out of this?
So I'm going to stop this screen sharing.
Thank you.
At this point, we are going to open this up to a discussion. So what I would recommend to all of our participants is to go into gallery view, which you can enter at the top right-hand corner of your screen. You should be able to click gallery view. That will allow you to see all of the other participants. Please feel free to ask questions or add your comments or perspectives by typing into the chat. Or if you would prefer, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand and I can unmute you from your screen. So, anyone want to kick it off?
Well, I have a question of Gilly, if I could.
Please, that'd be great.
That's the start, to break the silence. Gilly, could you explain non-teleological thinking to me?
Wow.
I'm sorry to spring that on you, but
I've been trying to create a simple guide to non-teleological thinking with my freshman classes for a number of years, and we never quite get around to writing it down. But I think non-teleological thinking has a couple basic tenets. One is that nothing is either good nor bad. There's always some aspect of something that makes it ambiguous. Another is that cause and effect. causality is a difficult thing to assess because everything is connected to everything else. So that's another tenet of non-teleological thinking, which makes assigning causality very difficult. So anything that's complex enough to be interesting and to characterize what goes on in the real world can't really be reduced to A causes B. And that, you know, in kind of picking up your theme of where we are today, I think the desire of our press and media to make everything simple, whether it's climate change or politics or COVID or anything else, people don't want to be given, you know, the whole picture. They want a simple answer. Do I wear a mask or not? Is the world going to end in 50 years? Will we have seafood in 60 years? And these things aren't yes or no questions. And so, like I'm doing now, once you start trying to explain the ramifications, it gets muddy. And so I think non-teleological thinking is basically that things aren't good or bad, everything's connected, and which makes causality a very murky concept.
Thank you. That helps a lot.
Wonderful question. And to kind of follow up on one of the themes, William, that you and your presenters were talking about liminality throughout the book and how relevant that feels right now. We are in this sort of liminal space as a country. And I would love to hear more thoughts about the theme of liminality from any of the speakers, the theme of liminality that runs through the book.
I just discovered the whole theory of liminality like a day ago or 2 days ago, trying to find a noun that is the word for the state of being liminal, in a liminal place. And I'm not sure there is a good noun for that. But it's not liminality. Liminality is a very specific theory developed by this guy, which he applied to human development and stages of life, but it can apply to societies and lots of other things. It was kind of a forgotten relic until somebody named Victor Turner picked it up in the 1960s. But it's based in Jungian philosophy and psychology, and it's really the underpinnings of it's the sort of developmental equivalent of Campbell's hero cycle. And Campbell studied in Europe with Jungians and certainly must have known about this concept. He quotes Van Gennep in Hero with 1,000 Faces, but only very casually. So that's about all I know, and I'm kind of fascinated to learn more about it and how it might have influenced Campbell, and if it did influence him as much as it probably did, why he didn't give it more credit. So that's kind of where I'm thinking right now. But I'm not an expert on the theory. Maybe one of the audience members has even heard of it and knows more about it. So sorry.
No, but Campbell does reference it in Hero with the
I looked last night. He only references it one place in the prologue, where he says he gives Van Gennep the credit for how the hero comes back with something valuable at the end of the journey.
Okay.
But that's it.
Right.
But the whole cycle thing is, probably Van Gennep didn't discover it either. It's probably in the Bible and lots of ancient literature sources, but I'm not a philosophical, not a philosophy expert, and so just a amateur reader of Wikipedia in this case.
Okay, but Campbell's very relevant to both Ricketts and
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Ricketts and Steinbeck knew him, and certainly I bet they knew about this Van Gennep book written in 1909. They were reading all these things. Ricketts had a Jungian therapist, and they knew Campbell, so it's hard to believe they weren't aware of this. But I'm not aware of any Steinbeck letters or any biographers that have ever pointed this out, this liminality thing. So
okay,
it's a good challenge for Don Coors if he's still out there.
right, any other questions from the participants?
There's a question on Ricketts' wife.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Susan, would you like to take that?
Yeah, just briefly. Her name was Anna, and they had 3 children, Ed Jr. and Nancy and Ricky. And she was very domestic. And so I think it wasn't, I think Ricketts was dedicated to his marriage, but he also wanted to sleep with as many women as he could. So he was really amoral in that way. And finally she got tired of it and left in 1936. But she did interesting things. I mean, she made a lot of the furniture for the lab. She made his ties. She cooked a lot. She was very, I don't know, sort of plucky, I thought. Went on a lot of Ed's collecting trips, but it just wasn't a marriage that was made in heaven by any. They had separate interests in a lot of ways. She was much more domestic than he, and probably the children I know found their father, of course, the more fascinating figure.
Susan, this is Geoffrey, and I just a follow up on that. One of the kids gave me a fairly long piece that she had written about their lives together.
Right.
Is that available anywhere?
Yeah, it's several places. It's at San Jose State Library. I think there's a copy at Hopkins. So it was never published, but it's a sort of self-published document, but you can get it various places. And she talks about their time together. It's interesting. But what strikes me is that she went collecting a lot with Ed. They were family trips. So a lot of, at least for a while, they were up north. So.
And she wrote about the collecting in that piece, which I found interesting.
Right.
And probably the biggest revelation of the real life Ed Ricketts is that he had been married and was the father of 3 children, which you don't get in the book at all, the fatherly figure. One
of whom, by the way, Nancy Ricketts, has just published her memoir called Becoming Myself.
Oh.
I have copies coming in the mail sent to me by Jan Straley. So if anybody wants one, I'm going to try to distribute them to local bookstores. We do have the awkwardness of COVID, et cetera, but Nancy writes about her life and where they lived in Carmel, et cetera. So it's a really nice little book. So a plug for that.
Good.
So if anybody wants it, write to, well, I guess, how would I do that? See, that's why I don't know quite how to be a bookseller, but stay tuned and you can contact us and get a copy of the book.
I have an answer to a previous question from Geoffrey, and Greg Kaye's here, so he can give the proper answer. So Geoffrey asked me what kind of rockfish this was on the wall behind me, and I said it's not a rockfish, it's a dog pargo from Mexico. And he asked, well, how's it related to a rockfish? And I said, I don't think it is closely related. It's more like a jack, which is not true. It's a snapper. So Greg can tell us how snappers and rock cod are related. You're muted. Greg, you're muted. Okay.
There you go.
Two different families, 2 different orders. Rockfish are in the scorpioniforms, and the other one, did you say pargo?
Yeah, it's a snapper.
Yeah, snappers. Those are perciforms. So they're totally different orders of fishes, different numbers of dorsal spines. Other than that, though, they're both fairly advanced teleost fishes. Let's say we don't have anybody in that family on the West Coast.
Yeah, and they're both really good to eat.
Yes, they are.
Thanks.
A lot of times in California, they call rockfish red snapper, and they do that because the snappers in general in the Gulf and on the East Coast are terrific food, rockfish are kind of bland. It's good tissue, but if you put the right seasoning on it, it tastes good. But it's not snapper.
There we go.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to go to one of the questions that's in the chat box. So Jean Arlisa's letter seems to imply that Steinbeck tried to minimize Ed Ricketts' influence on him after he died. And this question comes in from Linda. She says that she's wondered why Ricketts' name was taken off the book when The Sea of Cortez was republished as The Log from the Sea of Cortez. This was even though the chapter on non-theological thinking was actually one of Ricketts' essays. Was this related? So does anyone want to respond to that?
I think Susan should.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, so it was in part an editorial decision. So you always have to remember that books are published to make money. And so Steinbeck's editor wanted to reissue the book. He never liked Sea of Cortez in the first place because it was fat. And here's an author who just published, you know, in 1939, The Grapes of Wrath, and he goes off to Baja to write a scientific text. So Steinbeck's publisher, Pat Covici, was never too fond of that grip, and really thought the book was unwieldy. So when Ricketts died, he said, we'll sell more copies of this book if we just publish the log. And Steinbeck and Ricketts had agreed from the very beginning to split up the work so that Steinbeck did the log and Ricketts did the catalog. True, chapter 14 is Ricketts' essay, but Steinbeck also helped collect many of the animals. So I think that it was in part, first of all, an editorial decision. Secondly, you know, Ricketts had died, and I think Steinbeck thought, well, he may not care that much. I don't think that's Steinbeck's best moment. But thirdly, he wrote the essay about Ed Ricketts, I think to compensate for Ricketts' name being taken off. And, you know, it's probably doesn't really compensate to have his name taken off, but nonetheless, I think the essay is so beautiful and a real tribute to friendship that it probably does more for Ricketts' reputation than his name on the book would have. And then finally, I think Steinbeck thought, well, I did write the narrative for the most part, so it's okay if my name is on the narrative part. But he doesn't erase Ricketts. I think he sort of writes this, it's really kind of a eulogy. So that's kind of how he, and it should be at the front of the book. The decision to put it on the back of the book was a decision made about 15 years ago, but I think I always tell people to read it first. I don't know, Linda, if that answers your question.
Well, it's on the front, it does, but my question to you to follow up was, the one thing that Ed Ricketts Jr. told me about was that the residuals for the book were taken away from the family.
I don't remember if that, yeah, I talked to him about it too. He did sign off on it, but I don't remember if he got money too much. Maybe so. Maybe you're right, yeah.
I think what it was they were paid a small amount of money and then no more claims to any more rights.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Nancy Sewell, for reminding everybody that Nancy is going to be on a video. She is 95 in November. And so she'll be on a video for our final day of this. And, you know, you can always, that's why I'm getting the books, because of the video and her talk. So contact me and you can get a book.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one more question. And Jerry, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Let's see. Thank you. I wanted to let you know that I just am so enthralled by both of your presentations. But Geoffrey, we met quite some time ago, and at that time I didn't know a lot of my own history, my family's history on Cannery Row. But Don Coors has done research and found in Anna Ricketts' memoir that she said that my grandfather, Chinyip, was their most reliable shark fisherman. And I have talked with some of my aunties, one being 104 years old right now, and they have talked about how Ed Ricketts was kind, very kind. And I've said this before in other talks, but I just want to bring it home again today because you have brought up Ed Ricketts and Steinbeck's speaking out by signing that the document that Tim Thomas found. And I find it very moving regarding how Ed Ricketts and Steinbeck stood up for the Japanese and for the Chinese. And when my auntie said, you know, he's kind, very kind, I could tell in their voice how much they appreciated and really looked up kind of lovingly at how he treated them in a time when the community, America, did not treat Chinese well. So it's very moving to me that you have taken up, you know, making a point of bringing it out to people, because I think that from a sociological point of view, it's important to bring out the point of how Ed Ricketts treated other people and how these elderly women, my aunties, viewed him. And I just, you know, and how you brought it to, you know, the information that was written so long ago, but yet is so relevant today. And believe me, I feel it intensely. And I just want to thank you both. And thank you to the library for providing this forum. Thank you very much.
Jerry, that was very eloquent. Thank you. May I just make one more plug here? There's another book on Ricketts that I'll have soon. So if anybody wants to buy books, I'm now in the book business. It's called Ed Ricketts from Cannery Row to Sitka. And it is a updated edition of a book, a wonderful little book that has a Ricketts essay in it and then essays on Ricketts. So if you want to hear more about Ricketts, the man and Cannery Row, again, contact me and I will have these books soon.
Wonderful. Well, we are just about out of time. I want to thank all of our speakers for their really thoughtful looks at the book and the context for the book, and as Jerry mentioned, just really making it really relevant. Thank you to all of our participants also for comments and questions. Just as a reminder, next Thursday at 2 p.m., we're going to be kicking off our October film series with the film Silver Harvest, and that will be introduced by Steve Rosen, who is the filmmaker. So I hope you'll be able to tune in for that next Thursday at 2. Thanks again to everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Sydney.